Well, it's that time again, isn't it? It's Thursday. Means I get to look forward to only having one more day left in my work week. Work's about to start getting more complicated. It's going to start involving some overtime, but that's okay. I'm comfortable with that. It's more a function of how everybody else is doing here, because it's honestly something that I'm curious about. How are people? I see that we've got Crosshair, Kung Fu Fenris, Aragorn, and Low, and along with Zen Robo sliding in to the clinic at this time. And there's Joker. Hey, it's going all right. It's going okay. I am looking forward to the weekend for sure. But for now, I'm pleased. RPGClinic has its latest piece of tech, which we have to test out. Getting food after a long day at Comic Mines. I hear ya. Thanks, Aragorn. Thank you so much. That's 25 for you. There you go. And you got there. Yeah, Netrunner was fun. I mean, honestly, we're gonna have to figure out something so that Netrunner is a bit less opaque for people if we're gonna play it. But it was fun just to hang out with Scott. We really needed a chance to play the game because Netrunner is one of those games, because it involves a lot of bluffing. It really is best played in person, and at the very least, it's best played with somebody who you can talk to. And I was getting kind of burned out on Netrunner, but that's because I was playing a lot of it in an online format with people who I wasn't talking to, and then it's just not nearly as fun. So, but it is Thursday. I have a peach, which I can squeeze if I need to, and so we're here to talk today. Not just necessarily about this, but we're starting it off talking about villains and antagonists. Just put everyone in Zen Robo on the case and they'll whip up an on-screen prompt system for it. That is true. That is unfortunate true. The stress butt analog. I mean, like, that's basically what this is. Man, the FPS of this camera, not great. Despite the fact that I'm broadcasting at 60 FPS, this camera itself may not be able to support that, in which case, why am I broadcasting at that speed anyway? What am I broadcasting at this point? Ooh, yeah, only 30. In which case, then I'm really not maxing this out the way that I should. Of course, if I do this... Let's see if we can... Ah, there we are. And now, it's a little better. It's a little better. But I don't think it necessarily looks better this way. So honestly, I should be just knocking it down. Yeah, the image quality is worse. What I need to figure out, honestly, if we're being honest with ourselves here, is the concept of the frame rates just aren't going to be that good unless I end up going to a different camera system, and right now that's just not feasible. So we'll deal with it as it comes. The just one eye from the left. But I think this will be good enough to start with. We are... this was a topic that was suggested, I forget specifically by whom, but we had a request to talk about villains and antagonists, and it was first about villains, but the thing is, I decided to create it as villains and antagonists because villain is a very specific thing. Antagonists are also a very specific thing. So we might as well actually start with that. You have heard about it for a while. That is absolutely true, Kung Fu Fenris. So if we go right to the dictionary, which is not always the best place to start, but it's where we're going to start here. A villain is a cruelly malicious person who is involved in or devoted to wickedness or crime, a scoundrel, or a character in a play, novel, or the like who constitutes an important evil agency in the plot. And finally, a person or thing considered to be the cause of something bad. These are all kind of make sense in terms of what we're talking about here, but specifically the best description of it right now is number 2, that a character in a play, novel, or the like, so in this case it's a character in a role-playing game, who constitutes an important evil agency in the plot. But an antagonist isn't the same thing, and there are a lot of debates about it. So I am going to just quickly say that an antagonist is a person who is opposed to, struggles against, or competes with another, an opponent, or an adversary, but specifically in our case, the adversary of the hero or protagonist of a drama or other literary work. So an antagonist is somebody who is against the PCs. Whether or not they're a villain is another question entirely. We've had antagonists show up in stories that are ostensibly good people, but they are in the way. Think about any inspector that Sherlock Holmes has to deal with is going to probably be more often than not an antagonist because they're not actively helping Sherlock Holmes do his job. They may in fact be interfering with him or trying to get him to go away because this is a matter for Scotland Yard as opposed to a detective who lives on 221B Baker Street. You can also think of an antagonist as somebody who is a competitor or a rival of the main character, even if we're supposed to like them, even if they're supposed to be somebody who we enjoy their presence for. Gary fucking Oak. So I'm not completely up on Pokemon, I have to admit, but that would be a good way of putting it. Gary isn't a villain. He's not out to kill you, but he is your rival, somebody who you are trying to defeat, and therefore is an antagonist. So we have our definitions here. In terms of a role-playing game, a villain is somebody who is not just against the player characters, but is kind of against society or the world itself. If we were looking at D&D, a villain would be somebody who is who qualifies under the evil alignment. As much as I hate the alignment system in Dungeons and Dragons, Carmen Sandiego, it depends on the iteration. So the original version of Carmen Sandiego in the video games, more often than not, she was somebody who was a thief, who stole because she wanted to own things. And that would kind of make her a villain in that she is someone who is evil and needs to be stopped. Especially because a lot of the times what she was stealing was things that were beloved by the world around, right? Somebody who can steal the Parthenon or steal the Christ the Redeemer statue is somebody who is committing evil in a lot of people's eyes. Carmen Sandiego later on kind of got softened, and especially in the Netflix series, as I understand it, she's more of an anti-hero, or even potentially a hero who has some anti-law, anti-social tendencies, which would make her more along the lines of chaotic good if we're looking at the D&D alignment system. Because she doesn't necessarily go within the laws, or possibly even neutral good. I haven't seen it. Zen Robo has. She'd be able to tell you. So Crosshair says that Batman is a villain. Batman's not a villain, unfortunately. As much as I have railed against Batman in the past, Batman is not designed as a villain. Batman is designed as a complex character. At most, he's an anti-hero. Hey, Rock Pants, and anybody who wants to sing rockapella in chat is absolutely welcome to do so, because that was the bomb diggity. But yeah, Batman is at worst, he's an anti-hero, and usually he's actually a hero. And as much as people like to ascribe, dark, brooding things to him, he, in the end, is always trying to do good. Even if he isn't necessarily trying to do good in the exact most lawful way. that does not make him a villain. And he isn't an antagonist because in the vast majority of comics, he is the protagonist. He's the main character, somebody who is the one you're supposed to focus on. So we have that as well. The player characters in a role-playing game are almost always they're almost always not villains. We'll get to PC villains at some point, but they're always protagonists. And the main reason for that is because if a story's protagonists are the main characters of the story, that makes them the protagonists. Antagonists are the ones who act against the main characters. So if your story is told from the perspective of the villain, the antagonists are the good guys, specifically. Unless #secret villain, yes, of course, that is true. And there are times where PCs will be antagonistic towards each other, but that doesn't make them antagonists. They're all supposed to be the main character for the vast majority of role-playing games. Joker says, so I'm close to running 7th Sea, and I've been thinking of using the Inquisition as the stupid villain, but then I'm also thinking of a privateer as a more serious threat that actually acknowledges the players being a threat to his nation. So how do you balance a silly threat versus a serious threat? So that gets into the kinds of antagonists that we can look at. And we might as well go into that now that we've kind of defined what we're doing here. There are a lot of different kinds of antagonists that we can use, and there's a lot of different themes that you can apply to your villains and your antagonists as well. Your theme is based a lot on what kind of game you're playing and what the expectations are for yourself and your players as well. A game might have a lot of goofy comedy in it, but that isn't necessarily appropriate for a game where players are expecting tense, suspenseful, deep emotional conversations. They may not want wacky physical comedy villains stumbling in and bumbling around, but that's often a mismatch that you're going to find when people don't communicate enough, especially in their session 0, about the kinds of games that they want to play. But there are times where you'll have silly threats and serious threats in the same game. And this actually provides for a varied experience for players, and it can often help stave off fatigue, because sometimes you know that you can relax a little bit, you're dealing with a villain who may or may not be dangerous, but at the very least it's more of a laugh. And there are some times where you have to deal with somebody who is a bit more serious, a bit more intense, who may have more pathos or gravitas associated with them, and also somebody who is potentially a more dire threat because they're simply more effective than the goofballs. Goofballs tend to also be more of a threat because they have superior numbers, not necessarily because they are more competent than that. So I have to not look at the Serious Talk channel of RPG Clinic where they're discussing the American election right now, as opposed to in here. So the best ways that... No, there's nothing wrong with that. I just noticed that there was text scrolling, and I was like, oh wait, and I realized that I should be looking at the Clinic channel because that's where the information about the discussions are coming from. Makes me think of the ninja paradox theory that one ninja is deadly, but 1,000 ninjas are an absolute pushover. In a way, that's actually quite true. If you're looking at creating a villain, there's a couple of things that you have to look at first. And we're talking about villains here. We'll get on to non-villain antagonists in a little bit. Villains are, by definition, as we went over earlier, evil, or they represent the evil in the game. And it's important to make sure that that is clear in a lot of games, because the players want to know that it's okay to enact the fantasy around somebody who is designed to be the villain. What I mean by that is you might have characters who have the capacity to be violent, but who do not wish to attack somebody who they consider either innocent or not an equal threat. In a lot of ways, you'll get people who will say this, that in real life, they would never hurt a fly unless they're going to hurt a Nazi. Nazis are kind of like a staple of invoking a villain. And that, I don't encourage violence against anybody, but if you want to punch a Nazi, go right ahead. in some ways, in a role-playing game, you want to make sure that the players feel okay about actually defeating somebody, about attacking them, about causing them physical harm, or even killing them. And it's often easier to let the players do that if they know that who they are attacking are evil. And establishing their evil is also something that will help them feel better about taking them on. By establishing it means that you establish to what extents they're willing to go and to what depths are they willing to sink in order to see out their goals. Make sure that you're not going to violate any of your session 0 lines, veils, or anybody's absolute no-go areas. Villains are supposed to be evil, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we wish to be confronted with all evils. Common things are, if you have a villain who you really want to show is an irredeemable person in movies, you'll often find them hurting animals. Hurting a person makes you bad, but hurting a dog makes you downright evil. But some people really don't like to see innocents hurt in that fashion. Some people really, really don't like to see certain evil acts brought out. For instance, for me, incidents of sexual assault are something that I just don't want to deal with in games. And while sexual assault is something that is a very real problem and happens a lot and happens all the time in today's society, one of the things that I do to game is I want to examine certain things. This is not one of them, at least at this stage in my life, that I wish to bring up. So I will avoid having any of my villains be somebody who is who commits that particular crime. And that's just because it's something that I want to stay out. So we're going to get to evil in the eye of the beholder, Angel Wick, but we're going more towards the traditional villains right now, the ones who are established as evil. Once you've established them as evil, and once you've shown to what depths they're willing to sink, so saying that somebody is the evil prince is one thing. Showing that somebody is the evil prince is something else entirely. The idea that that everybody in a town says that guy's evil could just as easily be that the entire town doesn't understand that this person has been trying to help them but constantly bumbles it up. Or maybe this person is a magic user and the entire town is prejudiced against those who practice the arcane arts. Or maybe they're just racist. Or sexist or homophobic or whatever, and that doesn't necessarily make somebody a villain. But showing that somebody is willing to do something evil is something else entirely. Have them blow up a bridge. Have them kidnap the king. Have them deliberately mess with the finances of the player characters, but have them do something. In analyzing a narrative, if I ever come across a villain and the only thing that I've ever seen of this villain is just that they're fighting the player characters or fighting the protagonists, but I don't actually ever see them committing any evil acts, then I don't actually feel properly good for the protagonist at that point, because I'm just told that this person is evil. I want to see it. I want to experience the evil. And in some of the characters that I've played on the streams that we've run in the past for Exalted or for Changeling, there have been times where I have claimed that somebody is evil, but I haven't directly shown that evil to them. And oftentimes it's either because I'm baiting them, I'm baiting the players to make sure that they understand that it's not necessarily that just because people think that they're evil doesn't necessarily mean it's true, or that I want them to investigate further. So have them dastardly tie the mayor to the railroad tracks and then rescue a puppy from a well just to mix things up. I mean, that's fair. I had to catch Jeeves and hug him, but I wanted to throw out that utilizing your players' list of veils or lines to make them the worst villain isn't a way to use this information from your players and may sow distrust. So that is absolutely true. Somebody who's putting something down as a line, remember that a line in terms of safety tools is, this is something I do not want to see. It is a hard line. it is not an excuse for you to bring it in because you know that it's something that the player will react to poorly. A veil, something that a player is okay with existing in the game as long as it's happening off screen or hand waved away. Even that's not necessarily a carte blanche for you to do whatever you want in that area. So if I have a line of sexual assault, that does not mean that you can start thinking like, oh, I'll start saying that the villain is associated with sexual assault. I won't show it, but I'll say that it is so that they really know that it's bad. If it's a line, it means that I don't want to deal with it at all. If it's a veil, then I'm still basically saying that this is something that I'm not necessarily comfortable with in an open format. And so I would encourage people to be careful. Let your players guide you a little bit on how much of a veil is something that they really don't want to see, or how much of it is just like, I don't feel like describing it. Like, for instance, I'm okay with somebody saying like, the body is obliterated. But I'm not really okay with somebody describing in intricate, gory detail because I just don't care, and I don't find it interesting to hear about gore being described to a certain degree. So in that case, I don't really mind if you describe that a villain has done really gory things, as long as I don't hear the exact descriptions of what those things are. If I hear a vague description of gory things, then that's fine. But maybe my veil is actually approaching a line. It's a delicate situation. You're just going to have to balance it for yourselves. Double hugged. I do enjoy Jeeves hugs. Excellent antagonist suggestion. Jean-Baptiste Emmanuel Zorg from Fifth Element. He never even interacts directly with the protagonists. Yeah, I mean, Fifth Element is a cluster of a story and a universe there. So there is that. Sorry, I'm just going to go back up for a second. Joker says, sorry, I had to do the forehead. Wait a second. Something smells fishy in here. I don't think you guys are villain. Oh, you're quoting the Tick. Okay. But yeah, so we don't want to pull from lines and veils to make a villain bad. Kung Fu Fenris has mentioned that its players can't always see the villains doing their deeds. If I want to establish somebody as a villain, I will cut away to them. I have no trouble doing that. It's not something that should be done for a very long period of time. Players tend to get bored if you go on for more than a couple of minutes by yourself. You definitely don't want to go any longer than like 5 minutes. And if you start going on for an hour or more, then you're absolutely encroaching on, instead of it being a role-playing session, it's more of a story time session where you are telling them a story. Which, hey, if your players are into it, that's great. But I guarantee you that if people have showed up to roleplay, if they've got dice in front of them, they've got their character sheets, they want to be the ones affecting the story, and they want to start affecting the story as soon as possible and not wait. Cutscenes are an art form; they're hard to do well. I don't know if it's very hard to do well. I think it does take some practice, and I do think that there are ways to hint at it, but there are ways to show a villain being evil that don't necessarily involve showing them firsthand. You can give the players secondhand information. You can have somebody describe a villain's actions, but there's a big difference between saying, yeah, the villain has, they're evil. They show up in the town and they attack it sometimes, or saying the villain did this, or showing an NPC who said, I had this and now I no longer have it because of the villain. Make it personal to the character who's describing it. Instead of it just being a general, the evil wizard must be destroyed, have it be like the wizard who destroyed the bar, the wizard who stole our most sacred artifact. But even if you say the wizard destroyed the bar or stole the most sacred artifact, that's not enough. If you want players to truly feel like that it's important, you need to actually show why the bar was important, or why the artifact was so important, how people feel about the fact that they're not there anymore, or that things have been destroyed. Saying, yeah, he destroyed the bar might be enough for some people, but you'll get a better emotional reaction if you have someone say like, this is the place where I used to go after every day of hard labor. I would slide in. It would be the one thing that I'd get to look forward to all day was just having a drink, and now it's gone. And the bartender no longer has a home. and no longer has a business that they've been working at for their entire lives, and now they're destitute and have nothing. Well, now all of a sudden taking down the villain, it feels a bit better than just saying the villain destroyed the bar. Have the player characters walk through the remains of the bar, show them the shattered bottle of their favorite scotch, and being like, you could have had this to drink, but you can't anymore because somebody decided to be a big jerk and made you do that. So it is a balance, but you don't even necessarily have to have them ruin something that's dear to the players. You have to have them ruin something and show the emotional attachment to that. Because I can say, I cut down a tree, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a bad person. Maybe I cut down the tree because I needed shelter or needed firewood, or is there something happening behind me? If somebody comes and gets me, I'll know. But if I say that I cut down the life tree that's responsible for keeping the entire ecosystem of this area in check, well, that's something else. That's a little different. But now if I say I've cut down the life tree, and then another character says, like, I was hoping that I'd be like, I dragged my grandfather here over the course of 500 kilometers so that I could lay him by the life tree and hope that it might cure his disease, and now the life tree is gone. Well, now I have a better emotional connection because I see that it's affected somebody in an emotional fashion. There are times where you don't necessarily want to be this overt, especially if you want to tease whether somebody is a villain or not. I mean, as an example, when Entropy was introduced, Entropy was designed to be a chaotic character in Exaltwitch, but was an antagonist, but he was not a villain. He wasn't evil. His job was simply to just create chaos. And as a result, he came against the player characters who were attempting to create order. Also, that life tree had children. Yeah, like, kill a lion and nobody cares. Kill a lion and then show the lion cubs like walking up and pawing at the lifeless corpse of the lion that you just killed, and that's a lot more effective. I'm glad that Real Brickwell, you got your Twitch sorted out. That's a lot better. Simba, no! I'm still trying to parse why there was a Triad in Exalted, because Triads exist across a whole lot of different mythologies. Kung Fu Fenris. If you really didn't like it, then I'm sorry. Sounds like we're killing Mufasa. So, in Hamlet's father is already dead, and we meet him as a ghost, and the ghost is like, avenge my killer, yo, and Hamlet's like, ugh, okay, I guess. That's one way of doing it, but you'll see that for a kids movie, and something that's instantly way more gut punching, is we got to know Mufasa first, then Mufasa died, we saw Scar do it, and then we saw what effect it had on Simba. And that makes Scar a villain that we can really get behind hating. It's because we got the chance to become emotionally invested in something and then have it destroyed. Well, I mean, obviously we're talking about the Danish play, and yeah. Apologies to Danes, whom I hold in quite high esteem. But won't no one think of Scar's children? I mean, like, isn't that one of the things that happens in one of the direct-to-video sequels? Like Simba's Pride or whatever? Ugh. I don't know. And I, at the moment, don't... I'm focusing just on the original Lion King. I'm pretty sure that is like Scar's kid trying to like become accepted and not suffer for the sins of the father. Hey, Danes are cool, yo. Which is the Romeo and Juliet to the Lion King's Hamlet? Nomeo and Juliet, Real Brick Wall? Ew. Romeo and Juliet is remember that Hamlet actually ends up as a tragedy, and so does Romeo and Juliet. And Disney films of this type do not generally end in tragedy. So, all right. So, pulling it back, I realize. Feel free, by the way, in chat, if at any point you feel like I'm getting way too off topic and you need me to pull back to what I'm talking about, or if there was a point that I was going to talk about and then got interrupted and then I'd never get back to it. So a great villain is going to do something that has emotional resonance to the player, even if that is also an emotional resonance that is removed from the players. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a wrong that you do to the player characters, but it should be a wrong committed to somebody who the player characters care about. Appealing to somebody's sense of nobility might be enough, but it's going to feel better if you appeal to their emotional heart, if you appeal to their center. And that's not necessarily something that you have to do before you, right as you introduce a character. You can introduce a villain and make it ambiguous, even have them be somebody who's a friend, and then have them do something evil. But this is another thing that I'm going to bring up here. If you perform a heel turn, so a heel turn, this is of all things a wrestling term, but a heel turn is when a character who you formerly were supposed to root for now has done something that means that you should root against them. Hello. I am new here and mysterious. If you perform a heel turn, you need to be very careful, because remember that if you betray the player's sense of trust, you want to make sure that you're doing it at the appropriate time and in such a way that the players believe that it makes for a good story. If it doesn't happen as that, if players just feel like they can no longer trust anybody because you'll just make them evil, then paranoia sets in and players no longer feel like they have any control over the universe. They can become disillusioned with it, and then your game can collapse. You could totally have somebody betray other people. That is fine. And you can totally commit an atrocity as long as it's in the interests of the story. Imagine, if you will, that if you ask somebody to come up with a backstory for their character and they say, okay, well, here's information about my best friend. And they describe this best friend for 5 pages, and then you kill the best friend in the first session. Well, if they've gone to such an extent to describe this best friend, it probably means that they want the best friend to show up and to talk to them. You're fridging the best friend at that point, and the villain isn't as effective. If, however, the best friend betrays the player characters, well, now the person says, well, I came up with all this backstory for my best friend, and the character isn't who I expected because you had them betray us, and the player stops trusting you. But if if you can manage to do it in such a way that it feels like there were hints at it, that there were moments where it was like, oh, I did trust this person, but they never really stuck around afterwards. And then it turns out that it's because they were plotting against you. If the players can feel clever by putting the pieces together, that gets a great response from players there. Hey, Mr. Rich. Also, you really only get one good betrayal. You definitely can get one good betrayal, and often that's all you'll get. I have seen situations where it can go higher, but those tend to be very long-running games, or it has to be something that is building upon the first betrayal. But it's difficult to pull off. It is tough, and you definitely don't want to pull off betrayals that betray your players' trust. I'm really interested in trying to do I've never known how to pronounce this. Is it kayfabe? Kayfabe? I think it's kayfabe, but I'm trying to do a kayfabe revelation in a game to comment on the opposite. Can you give us an example, Aragorn? Kayfabe is the idea. It was again a wrestling term where wrestlers pretended like everything was real that nothing was scripted, that even outside of the ring, wrestlers were supposed to pretend like everything was still real. And putting up that front is known as kayfabe. If you really want to kill trust, do a betrayal into redemption into another betrayal. Yeah. Someone who has been the antagonist or secondary villain throughout the game, but then is revealed to have been putting on an act and they've secretly been supporting the heroes. See, I actually really like this trope. It's sometimes easier to do the redemption arc, but having them be like, no, I've actually been trying to help you this entire time, if you can pull it off, is fantastic. But remember that if you're doing that, you still don't want to betray trust. You want to be able to set it up so that when this character reveals themselves, that players can put the pieces together and be like, that at least makes some logical sense. Vampire the Masquerade, Prince of the City turns on the PCs, a stereotypical portrayal, jihad and all. Yeah, I mean, I don't think Vampire actually has maintained the use of the term jihad. I think they've, in 5th edition, I believe, they sunset that term. So there is that. Secret ally is hard if the players hated them too much. I mean, it's... One of the things that you also have to accept is that if you do that kind of turn, if you do a secret ally, you have to let the players' emotions be, you have to let them enjoy their own emotions and like understand and appreciate their situation. What I mean by this is if your players hate somebody and then you're like, but they were secretly a good guy, and they were like, fine, they were secretly a good guy, but I still hate them. That's valid. That's okay. And I've seen GMs struggle to have NPCs that they've invested a lot of themselves in be liked by the player characters, and it comes across as desperate, to be honest. The idea, and it smacks almost of GMPC. So GMPCs are things that generally I try to tell people to avoid. The concept of, I really wanted to play this character, but either because the character is overpowered or because I couldn't find anybody to run the game, I created them as an NPC instead, but I'm going to invest myself in them as I would a PC. That is a dangerous thing to do. And if you are trying desperately too hard to have your player characters like an NPC, they will often resist it and go the opposite way and just continue to hate them more. So if you do pull that reveal, and your players are like, okay, you might be a good guy, but that still doesn't mean that I have to like you, accept it. Lean into that even. And you might find that if you don't push it, then players may warm up to somebody instead. It happened with Starlight Dove from Exaltwitch. I got the distinct impression that because Starlight Dove was an enigmatic figure who was not necessarily outright helping or hindering players at times, there was often this sort of feeling of like groans when Starlight Dove came up, like, oh damn, or ugh, she's like, I don't know how to feel about her, I don't know whether she's a villain or not. But then when it became clear that she was acting in the PC's best interests, I didn't push it. And then towards the end of the game, they welcomed her, at least more than before. And I think that a large part of that was because I wasn't pushing it too hard. I wasn't trying to make Starlight Dove a thing. In much the same way that I didn't try too hard to make Summer Blaze a thing. You know, they kidnapped her and they put her on a redemption arc. If there's one thing that my players love, it's a good redemption arc. Sometimes I'm just like, no, just hate this person. They're like, no, we must save them. And I'm like, ah, God damn it. And like, it often honestly works out for the best. But, you know, like that was, they put her on a redemption arc, but I didn't force it because it just wasn't Tide. Yeah. Exquisite Tide, the same thing. So Exquisite Tide was a character who was a straight up villain, and we saw her do villainous things, and then when it was sort of revealed that she might not necessarily be as much of a villain as we would have anticipated earlier, didn't push it. Even when I was like, yep, and you're linked to this character directly, that was okay because I didn't push it. So just in terms of if you ever want to turn your villain into a good person, into a deuteragonist, don't lean into it. Don't lean into it and let your players come to you. Don't rush up to your players and try to get them to love your villain. So Joker says, I got an interesting question. So in Deadlands, the villains are evil because, other than their personal tragedy, they are manifestations of the four horsemen of apocalypse. So technically, they are the force of nature. Then in other games, villains are characters who see themselves as heroes, while the players are perceived as villains. Which approach do I like more? Which one is more effective? They're equally effective. But one thing that I will point out is that there is room for the mustache-twirling villain who is evil for evil's sake. Sometimes that's a lot of fun. But if you're playing a serious game, almost nobody does things for the purpose of being evil. They justify their actions to themselves. That justification can be twisted, but people tend to not to paint themselves as the bad person in their personal story. Somebody who kills a school bus full of children in order to gain power believes that power is because there's something else in the world that needs this power, and I need to harness it. It could be that somebody who wants to rule a kingdom might genuinely believe that they could do a better job at ruling the kingdom, or at the very least be like, if I can rule this kingdom, I can do as good a job as anybody else, but at least I'll also be benefiting myself and my family. Some people, it can be very selfish, but still altruistic. I did this for my brother, who I love dearly. Even though I've now done horrible, horrible things, I did it out of love. So both kinds of villains are acceptable. Both are totally fine. It's not something that I would necessarily say is one over another, but it does depend on the tone and theme of your game. Crosser says, I would add on, even if your setting is that of betrayal and mistrust, say a campaign in a Thieves Guild, the same concepts apply. Even if all NPCs are backstabby betrayers, PCs friending them and then getting stabbed is not cool just because of the setting. So this ties into, again, if your players stop trusting you as a storyteller, you're in trouble. You never want to lose player trust. You want them to feel like if you have a character who's betrayed them, it was in the service of the story and they feel great. But if they feel like you betrayed them because you are trying to emotionally manipulate them, and that it doesn't make for a great story, it just is a way for you to one-up them, then you've lost their trust. And in a lot of ways, that can also occur that if they don't trust anybody in the game, you'll find that it'll be difficult for you to introduce even friendly characters because they just, you've been training them to not do things. It's a carrot and stick approach. If you're hitting them with a stick constantly, eventually every time they see you, they'll cringe and cower away from you, even if you're holding a carrot. Exquisitide is going to come all over all y'all's asses. This is true. By any chances, am I familiar with Deadlands Stone? He is a major NPC. His whole arc is I am death. Hell actually fears me. It's my purpose to kill PCs when they become too much of a threat, so he's sort of an evil version of the Saint of Killers. I find him fascinating, but the catch is that even stat-wise, he's indestructible. He is the Mr. X/Nemesis of the Deadlands verse. So there can be a point where I would absolutely love to, like if I see that a player character is getting too big for their britches, then having somebody built into the game to be able to take them out can actually be a useful thing. Kids on Brooms, for instance, has a mechanic whereby if a player character ever kills somebody and it wasn't in self-defense, that character immediately becomes an NPC. So if you ever want to commit murder, you lose your character. You can still do it. If you believe that that's what's best for the story, you can still do it, but you will lose your character right away. There's also things that if you constantly abuse your magic powers, eventually a council for the ethical use of magic will strip you of your magic powers because you're just too much of a threat. And the game basically is like, if this happens, that's it. your character's donezo. And so this sort of mechanic exists, but it exists in a lot of different ways, and it doesn't necessarily have to involve death. But remember, as a storyteller, you have the final say in what happens in a game. And if what you say is rocks fall and everyone dies, as unsatisfying as that may be, it is a thing that you can do. So there is that. Like divine rights rule over actually being good for humanity. Yeah, fair. In betrayal-prone setting, maybe begin to drop hints like one of your friends is about to betray you. So there is that. But also, if you drop a hint that someone's about to betray you, and players immediately are like, "Oh no, like no way, not if Keith betrays us, then that's fucking it. Like I quit the game." But if you just dropped a hint, you can reverse course on that. There's nothing wrong with that. Of calling an audible if your players just have a vitriolic reaction to what you've just displayed, just don't do it. That's totally fine. As I'm reading 7th Sea, and there's a mechanic which I find interesting but hard for the PCs. Villains are not meant to kill PCs in 7th Sea. They play a lot with the cliche of, now that I've defeated you, I've put you in a cage with a trap while I monologue my evil plan. The villains are expected not to pull... I think what you mean, the villains are expected to pull death blows. Yeah, and that's part of the tone of that game, which is a swashbuckling adventure. In swashbuckling adventures, the heroes don't lose. So if you kill them, you have broken that theme. And that's something that's to keep in mind for villains as well, right? Like, you don't necessarily want to break that theme if that's what your game is asking for. So yeah, to pull a death blow, Joker, in the idiom is to pull a blow means to stop before you do it. Pull your punches means that you're not punching as hard as you can. You're going easy on them. Yeah, no problem. Just to clear that up. Villains don't pull death blows. There's just so much armor on the PCs. I mean, it depends, but yeah. So the idea of a villain in a game advancing a plot is something else that I wanted to bring up. Sometimes you will encounter a situation where the world is going okay and that there isn't any immediate fire for the player characters to put out. And it sometimes is tempting to have the villain do something dastardly in an attempt to spur PCs to action. Useful, proceed with some caution. Make sure that you're not fridging somebody. So I've brought this up before. I'm going to bring up the actual definition of fridging because I think that it's important, especially in a conversation about villains, about fridging, because this is a very important thing that I want people to avoid. If a character is killed off in a particularly gruesome manner and left to be found just to offend or insult someone or to cause someone serious anguish, you are fridging them. The usual victims are those who matter to the hero, specifically best buddies, love interests, and sidekicks. In some cases, the doomed character may be killed by natural forces or by a character who doesn't have the intent to cause someone else angst. In this case, the intent comes solely from the writer, who wants to rouse strong emotions in another character. If the said character... stuffed in a fridge. You're right. If the said character was killed by a villain, this guarantees to become a motivation for a revenge plot or an immediate roaring rampage of revenge. The name of the trope comes from a storyline in Green Lantern, in which the villain Major Force leaves the corpse of Kyle Rayner's girlfriend, Alexandra DeWitt, literally stuffed into a refrigerator for him to find. Years later, Major Force repeated the gimmick with Kyle's mother in an oven. It was just a trick with a mannequin that time, though. But anyway, the thing is, fridging is something that you want to avoid if at all possible, because if you are doing that to basically say, look at what a badass this villain is, you aren't creating a compelling narrative. You are essentially just punching player characters when they're down. And not giving them any way to deal with it. Worst goddamn plot point in a comic. I mean, so I'm going to say something that I may end up regretting, but there is an opportunity to take something away from player characters and have them feel it. But if you just do it literally just so that it makes the player characters mad, that's no good. So as an example, if you have a player character, and let's say your player character has a husband, and then the villain kills the husband for no reason other than I wanted to make the PC angry, or I wanted to throw the PC off their game, you have fridged that character. And in 99% of cases, this is an unsatisfactory way of doing it. But let's say that the husband was also a spy who worked for the same agency, and that husband is like, I'm getting closer and closer to finding out this really crucial truth about something, and then the next session you've discovered that this character, the husband, has been killed because they got too close. Well, now at least there's a reason for the husband to be dead beyond I just wanted to piss you off. It's still a delicate situation, and you may not want to do it because, again, remember that if you're violating player trust too much and the player is now saying, well, now I can't ever love somebody because you'll just kill them, at least now it makes some narrative sense, and it is something that's a bit better. To you, it was the most traumatic and defining point of your life. To me, it was Tuesday. Yeah. So there is something to be said about that, but making sure that the plot point is not just shock value is, I think, the key thing that we have to take away from this. And your villains will be more effective if they have a reason for what they're doing, which is why when I design villains, I always think about what the villain's goals are and why the villain might do something. And if the answer is because I need the plot to move forward, I have to reverse engineer that. It's okay if you have I gotta move this campaign into high gear. I gotta motivate the characters to go after the villain. That's okay. But now start thinking about how to do that instead of just saying, well, I need this to happen, and just go ahead and just drop the first idea that you have. A villain needs to have grounding in reality, whether that reality is the same reality that we have in this world or whether it's their own reality. It still has to have grounding to it. In my game, instead of just letting a character die, I allow them to live, injured, and letting the PCs know things like he tried to kill me, but I ripped his eye out. I mean, it depends. Death can really, really help a game. They can create wonderful moments if it's done correctly, but you just have to be careful. And instead of stuffing them in a fridge. That's fair. I mean, fridging, ugh, it's just gross. Don't do it. There's a lot of reasons why villain is the way they are. So if you can, let me put it this way. Let's say that your villain kidnaps the hero and has to give a monologue about why they did everything that they did. If you can't accurately state why a villain did something, then you need to work on what your villain's motivations are. If a villain said, I killed somebody because I like killing, think about that for a second and like, is that enough? Like, I like killing. That doesn't make for a very compelling story. It may be like, it might be true. The villain may enjoy killing very much. And you may have established that this guy really likes killing. And look, this villain has just killed somebody. So that's what we've got. And that's all the justification I need. Just because something can happen doesn't make it narratively interesting. And that's something that is a thing that we want to avoid. I killed him because he was getting too close to the truth, and I loved every second of it, is way better than I killed him because I love killing. Same thing gets across, like, oh, this guy is kind of a creep because he likes killing people. But one of them, there's actually some justification and some narrative reasoning behind it, something that we can track and follow. The other one is just, oh, he just really likes killing. Not nearly as interesting. Zesty Artist asks, have you ever run a game where an NPC has faked their death unbeknownst to the players? I have done that sparingly, but players are getting very good at no body no death. If you don't see the body, if you haven't like seen the person and verified that they're dead, they're probably not dead. And much like betrayals, you might get one good instance of that before you basically have, you've gone to that well and you can't revive it any longer. Because if it starts becoming a situation where everybody who is ostensibly dead, they have to see the body, well, then it gets to be kind of gruesome. You generally don't want player characters to be the kind of people who are like, no, rip his head off, because otherwise we're not sure that he's actually dead. They become bloodthirsty, and sometimes, I mean, hey, if that's the kind of game you want to run, go for it. But in a lot of cases, it makes player characters feel a lot less heroic and a lot more like Batman. If they didn't die on screen, yeah. And please don't kill player agency with the villain. We're the Blade of Right. We've come to end your reign of terror. You never should have gone against us, villain. Who are you again? I mean, Crosshair is correct in most cases. Sometimes it could be really funny if the villain's just like, wait, what? The point is that if a villain doesn't respect the player characters, make it clear that that's a narrative choice and not just like oh yeah, no, whatever, you're just not important. Like, maybe they don't know right away, but then the villain remembers you for next time. Or maybe the first time they encounter somebody and they haven't made a name for themselves, the villain's like, who are you? But the second villain will have heard about it. That's where you can kind of work that in. But yeah, you generally, like, if a player character is level 20 in a D&D game, they're known. They're famous. And to take that fame away from them in a way that's just designed to be like, haha, and like to like flick their nose instead of actually doing something that is worthwhile, not great. Resist the urge to try to make your villain look like too much of a badass, because trying too hard will have the opposite effect. Here's a good rule. If a story/hero is only as good as their villain, it often falls on you to raise the level of the villain to raise your heroes. And then Joker says, as someone who is running Cyberpunk, I've also been curious about corporations as villains, but as passive villains, you know they are evil and they will only mess with you if you mess with them. Yeah, no saying all level 20 is really too damn stupid. Depends on the villain. Like, if you come from another plane of existence, maybe you haven't heard of them, but it's understandable. So to go for villains, you'll often hear people say that the villains have the best lines. In a role-playing game, villains have to have great lines, but remember that the part of what players get out of being in a game is that their characters also get to be cool. Resist the urge to have your villain always be cooler than the player characters at all times. Always more powerful, always have the coolest tech, always have better gear, always have, like, and if they get defeated, then you don't give the players the satisfaction of that victory, and the villain's always running away to come back. Or even if the villain is defeated, then they're like, yep, but the villain might die, but the villain dies in like a cool heroic pose and like without regrets, and everybody still loves the villain for the rest of their lives. Resist the urge to force your villain to be the coolest character, because the player character should at some point get to feel that way. Corporations will definitely mess with you even if you don't mess with them, just in an impersonal way, like season and level the entire block you live on by purchasing it, but not because of you, but because they have stuff going on. So Real Brick Wall, that's exactly what I was going to say. Corporations can do evil things that aren't about you, but that are just evil things, and for you to deal with it. I mean, look at Facebook, right? Facebook enabling interference in elections by not being vigilant enough about stopping things like bots and stuff like that. Like, hey, that's a corporation who wasn't trying to be evil doing something evil. And player characters can get involved in that as soon as they see the results of that evil. Aragorn says, I'm currently in a D&D campaign where we're constantly running into baddies who are asking, wait, who are you? Or I'm amazed you've actually made it this far, but we've kind of embraced it as a whole. Our party is just failing and flailing forward because we lost our strategy guy early in the game. We've moved heavily into the worst surprise too. Anyway, we're going to defeat you now, hopefully mood. So like, yeah, and like that can work. Absolutely. It kind of depends on the agency that your players are looking to get. Yes. Discussions are almost always guidelines. things like playing against expectations can often be some of the best things, even if those expectations are there for a reason. Hobby Lobby stealing ancient Mesopotamian artifacts. Look, Hobby Lobby is evil for a lot of different reasons. I'm just going to throw that out there without getting too much into it. Crosser says, I've always liked Shredder as an antagonist, maybe villain, due to his I can't be asked method, often just sending minions to deal with the turtles until he's had enough. It's a nice balance of, I know you're heroes, I want you dead, but you're not that great. So there is something to be said about that, but some of that was also the comics code and the television code. You'll notice that in the television series for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the animated series, the turtles never actually used their weapons against bad guys. So if they had a sword, they would use the sword to knock a garbage can into somebody and they'd fall down, unless they were robots. Robots were fair game. And remember that most of the Foot Clan are robots. So it is a thing that we just have to pay attention to. That sometimes the reason why villains were like, it was because they also were like, we don't want to get rid of this villain because we don't want to go to the effort. We're trying to bring this under a budget. And budget is something that is also something that you can pay attention to for your games. In fact, one day we might have that as a whole discussion. Your budget is your own personal, what you're willing to invest into a game. And you might say, like, I don't want this villain to die because I don't have another villain ready to bring into the game because I haven't statted them out yet, or I'm not that good at coming up with these sorts of things on the fly, or because I really like this villain and honestly if this villain dies then I have nothing left in the game to care about. It is a thing to keep in mind. What are my thoughts on the Eldritch Horrors as villains? I'm going to stop you right there. No offense, because in terms of things like Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraftian horror, first of all, horror as a genre has very little sway over me because I don't tend to get scared that easily. It's not something that I'm interested in that much. But I specifically don't like Lovecraftian horror. I find it's something that I think a lot of people can enjoy, and that's fine. I especially love how things like recent things that involve the Lovecraftian universe are going specifically against the utter racist bullshit that Lovecraft was involved with. But I just, there's also things like mechanics around sanity. Sanity is, it is difficult for me to enjoy those things in the context of a role-playing game. Not impossible, but difficult, because I think that sanity is one of the hardest things for people to play with. So Lovecraft Country, Lovecraft Country, watch it if you want. It's just not my thing. Like, I just, there are so many other things that I want to watch before I would watch that. I'd watch it if I needed to for work, but in general, there's just other things for me to look at. Campaign 3 months later, Heroes, just how many avenging villain brothers should that guy have? I ran out of ideas. I mean, clones, right? So that in terms of like Eldritch horror, I really also personally don't like the mechanic of you see something and it drives you insane. Just not, it's not interesting to me. Like, breaking somebody mentally, if it's mental illness, then it's just like, sad. And if it's like, oh, I've truly just freaked somebody out to the point where like they give up or whatever, then I want to see what that is. And it can't just be like a scary tentacle and somebody beholds a god and it's just like, oh, I can't do it. So yeah, not my favorite. I'm not saying that it's not impossible to do it, and I'm definitely not saying that it's not something that a lot of other people can enjoy. It's just, you're asking about my opinion, and that's sort of where I fall on that one. The generic stereotype of culture trying to summon XYZ who shall not be named. See, to me, that's slightly different, but it's still not my favorite plotline. So there's also something wrong with the game when you're afraid of sources of information. Yeah, there is that. It is kind of frustrating when someone's like, well, I'm gonna go look this up, and then they come back and they're like, I'm permanently messed up now because I dared to look into it. I just find that it limits player choice. But again, also, it's because horror is just not for me. I find other ways to express things. So don't take this as me shitting on your favorite thing. One of my best friends is somebody who loves horror. My twin sister watches 30 horror movies every October and blogs about it. And I just don't give a shit about them. So what would I say is the most cliche villain trope that I wish would just die? Requiem Lost, this is cheating. I will think of a better answer for this, but my first initial answer is that the real villains are humans in a zombie apocalypse. Mostly because I think zombie apocalypses are just played out to me at this point. But it's because the zombie trope now is not that zombies are evil, but inevitably it's either those who created the zombies are evil or everybody is evil, because once you take away society, the inherent selfish nature of man means our downfall. And I'm tired of hearing that. It's kind of nihilistic and I just don't care. The real villain trope is enforcing some really bad tendencies in the real world. The most cliche villain trope that I wish would just die. Are you talking about in role-playing games, Requiem, or are you talking about in general media? Because the most cliche villain trope that I wish would just die is the hit my weak spot 3 times and I fall over dead. There's a reason why we're moving past that. Good spot to put in my caveat. Read the table. Sometimes you're running a game for players who want to go, look, a dragon, it's evil, kill it, with zero interest in plot or reasons or such. Trying to put a thought-out villain into a game for players who don't want one can be painful. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. You know, it's a lot of it is reading the room, and some of it is also just creating the tone that you're looking for. If you throw 3 wacky characters, 3 wacky villains against the characters and then throw a serious character, well, they might have a bit of trouble dealing with the serious. If you throw 50 wacky characters at the player characters and then throw a serious one, that might cause emotional whiplash, and that's a little too tough. Other villain tropes that I'm not a huge fan of. For a while I was hearing an awful lot of Thanos copies. Thanos as a villain is... remember, like, he has justification. I mean, minor spoiler warnings, I guess, for Thanos and for the Avengers movies and stuff like that. But his justification is that, like, there aren't enough resources in the world, so I'm going to just kill half of all living things, which is, you know, bad justification and reasoning. In the comics, it's because he wanted to impress death. But just the concept of someone who's like, I'm evil, and what I'm doing is blatantly evil, but I'm doing it because it has to be done. I think that's a very easy trope to fall into, and it's very, very dangerous. Have justifications, but if you try too hard to make it seem like, well, your villain is correct, what story are you telling? This was an issue that a lot of people had with The Last of Us 2. The Last of Us 2 spends an awful lot of time being like, look how horrible killing is. Look how horrible it is when we resort to violence. But then they do not give the player the choice to avoid violence. So what are you trying to tell the player at that point? Like, look how awful it is. The thing is, they do it over and over and over again. And it's ostensibly in an area where, like, stealth might have been an interesting mechanic, but, like, a game that says killing is wrong and then hands you a gun and says go kill 50 people and don't come back until you do, without supporting that a lot better, I find that that's an issue. And in much the same way, if you say go and fight the villain, but you go way too hard in saying but what the villain is doing is correct, well, then what are you actually trying to encourage the players to do? I love villains who are justified to themselves. I don't like villains who are justified to the game master, because then it becomes a little bit then it also focuses a little too much on jam PCs sometimes, where you're like, no, but I like this villain, and then you start convincing yourself that the villain actually correct, and then maybe the player character should ally themselves with the villain instead. And if you haven't built the game up to that point, what you're essentially doing is saying everything that you've worked for up to this point is incorrect and wrong. And I don't like that idea. I experienced this in a game that I was playing in, where I was playing a character who was fighting on the side that he was utterly convinced was the side of good. And then the game master came to me and said, okay, so you're very good at fighting on the side of good, and all of your friends and allies think that you're doing a good job. And then by the end of the game, made it very, very clear that I was on the wrong side of the war. But there was no justification for it. There was no way for me to know that that's what was going to come up. And I just felt cheated. So just be careful. I hate movie Thanos because he's either wrong and he's a huge idiot for slaughtering accountable people without checking to see if he's right, or he is right and the universe is doomed because he won't share his research. I mean, I'll also point this out. It's okay if movie villains aren't perfect. It is okay if not everything is perfect in a game. It is okay if the justifications or reasoning have holes. A hole is not necessarily indicative of something being worthless. I will also point out that mistakes that are made do not necessarily invalidate an entire product. So as an example, I'll pull the Thanos thing. When I saw Avengers Endgame, the excitement in that crowd, I saw it on the first day. Excitement in the crowd was palpable. There was cheering. There was like genuine emotional reactions to that film, and they nailed it. 90% of it was just spot on. Yeah, there are some issues with Thanos's motivations, and he's wrong in some ways. And honestly, I don't think that makes it a worse film. Not that much. Yes, I don't like certain things that happened, especially when it comes to female characters in that movie. That it's not my favorite. Like, it's not great, but I would say that I don't like. And obviously, I'm a dude, so I react to things differently. I have my own privilege, but I don't think that one instance of something is enough for me to be like, well, that movie was absolutely worthless, and I never want to see it again. So there is that. I could understand if you feel the same way, but I am here to say that it's okay for there to be mistakes. It's okay for there to be things that aren't perfect. Especially in your games, if a player points out that like a villain has, if a player points out a plot hole in your game, you can be like, oh damn, yeah, sorry. It's okay. It's all right. Like, avoid it when you can, obviously, strive for excellence, but it's okay if you're not perfect every time. There's a D&D podcast that covers a group of adventurers requesting through a world that has already been saved. Essentially, they see as some of the first groups of adventurers made things worse or even cut corners in order to be victorious. Like, that's an interesting way to do it. Absolutely, I think that's cool. Alan Moore can eat my entire ass. I will also point out that Alan Moore was in a lot of ways first. And in much the same way that game design has progressed. Like, would you be willing to say that the people who developed Advanced Dungeons and Dragons were awful, awful, awful people because that game isn't nearly as good as 5th edition? Someone's got to be first. And like, I think Alan Moore has troubling issues, of course, but like, Watchmen was groundbreaking for its time. And unfortunately, if something is groundbreaking, that usually means that they're, first, other things refine on the concept. And then you look back at it and you're like, oh yeah, it's this thing that I've seen a million times, not realizing that it's the first one. So, spoilery, I think I can say, I'm just going to read it first because I don't want to read a spoiler aloud. Yeah, I would agree with you, Erwin. I would agree with you wholeheartedly. Which villain am I proudest of personally? It's funny because the villains that I'm most proud of are the ones that my players reacted to and shaped. Remember that I tend to do a lot of things based on on the input that I get from my players, and I try not to plan things too far in advance because I want to see where they're going. But there are characters in my games that ended up having redemption arcs where I was really putting them forward to be like awful people, and I think those I'm proud of because I feel like the players earned those redemptions, and that to me is a cool moment. So Exquisite Tide is a villain who I'm quite proud of. I thought Talus ended up doing quite a good job for what was worth for him. Those are two that I could say I'm definitely happy with, for sure. A small villain that I'm really pleased with. A small villain I'm really pleased with was the Apothecary in Exaltwitch. The Apothecary who was selling drugs to Ray's father and in turn was killing him, was actually getting him addicted to a substance, and then it was killing him, but he needed to keep the things. Thing is, he did it strictly because he was trying to save his own family. He was poor, he found a way to save his own family, and he figured that it was an acceptable sacrifice for somebody else to do. Blatantly evil, justified, but Ray, and it was enough that Ray may have killed him, but we left it ambiguous at the time because it was a thing for Liz that Ray not kill people, but she was like, she might kill this guy, maybe she did, maybe she didn't. That to me was a good villain. The Aragorn, are you? Oh yeah. In regards to what? What do I have to say about antagonists? So, we've been talking a lot about villains. Let's move on to antagonists for a bit. Antagonists are people who are acting adversarial to the characters, but who are not necessarily like all villains in a game. Usually, assuming that the PCs are not villains themselves, are antagonists, but not all antagonists are villains. Some examples of antagonists that may come up. Reggie was an antagonist, but he wasn't a villain. Entropy was an antagonist, but not a villain. Fucking Reggie. See, like, we can hate a character, a smarmy character who like lives to make the PC's lives difficult, but he wasn't evil. He never actually did anything that was outright evil. He did things that were self-serving, and he did things that were annoying, but he wasn't evil. Lady Sophia. And like it's my favorite villains are the ones that can make the protagonist act against their nature, even if only for a split second. Yeah, that's a good metric. I like that metric. Antagonists spice up the world, and they remind people that there's the evil that needs to be undone, but sometimes it's that person who just man spreads on the bus, and it gives you the chance to have little victories. It also gives you the chance to exact victory on somebody without necessarily being having to go all the way or wholehearted, right? Like the player characters never decided to kill Reggie, but they put him down. They got to act like they got to prove themselves to be cool by winning over him, even though winning over him didn't necessarily mean that they were being heroic. And I think that that's an interesting and useful thing to do. So, there's value in having antagonists that way. And sometimes antagonists are, in fact, on the side of right. So many cop shows or cop movies. I mean, I know that cop movies right now and cop shows are morally in a gray area to a certain extent, but when the feds come in and they're like, this is our jurisdiction now, and the detective who's been on this case is like, but it's my color, and they're like, not anymore, it's not. Well, they're antagonists, not villains necessarily, but they're antagonists. Zesty Artist puts it very well in saying Antagonists are great for story flavor, not to drive story, but to lend reality. And I think that's absolutely true. Because sometimes the world isn't perfect, and sometimes the world is out to get you, and that's just something you have to deal with. Sometimes even the NPC friends hop to an antagonist side for a moment. Yeah, absolutely. Like, absolutely, there are times where you'll get that frustration in. For sure. Because and sometimes that's one of the best things is somebody who you've worked with and enjoyed and like, and then all of a sudden you're working against them. But it's not because they're evil, but it's just because they have a differing opinion on what needs to be done, or they have a different goal. Can be really compelling. It's kind of amusing, but my current PCs are much more antagonized by antagonists over villains. Villains are dealt with, but there's some trepidation and caution, and maybe this is out of our jurisdiction vibes, but give them a bartender who won't sell them whiskey when they want it, and they'll want to burn and salt the earth. Nice. When the Oathbound Knight is forced to stop you. Yeah, like, that's a great example. The Knight is only respecting their code of honor, something that maybe the player characters hold in great esteem, but that doesn't mean that they have to put up with it. You know? And then an antagonist can also force player characters to make choices that are different than the ones that they normally do. If you have a kill-happy group who thinks nothing about just, like, utterly destroying, killing anybody who comes across them who stands in their way, an antagonist who isn't necessarily evil means that they may have to find another way to deal with them that doesn't involve their, like, you know, their standard procedure. Oh god, one of the things I hate with villains is when they can't put up a proper fight because of the dice or because the PCs manage to pull a one-punch kill. So Joker, there are definitely ways that you can mitigate that problem. First thing is that villains can be awesome even if they can't put up a fight. The second is that you can... Fools, this isn't even my final form. You can have it be that the person behind the curtain, so they were not the true villain and that there's someone else behind them. It could be that they kill the villain and then all of the villain's underlings make him out to be a martyr and somebody rises in the ranks. There are ways to deal with that. Poor John. What do you mean by poor John? Sometimes it's tough to catch up with the chat because if I don't see it when it comes right out immediately, I miss the reference. A certain Zed Werewolf in her dice roll, I'm completely fine with that. That's the other thing. If the player characters feel like it was got a good battle out of it, if they feel awesome, I have no problem. I don't need to win. I need for the story to be interesting and good. That's what I need. And you can always fudge dice. Like, look, I don't like doing it, and I know that other people do it, and very occasionally I've done it. But you know, like, there's a cleric hiding behind a curtain who casts fucking cure serious wounds. It's a thing that you can have happen. I see antagonists act against the player's interest, but not necessarily trying to defeat the player. And antagonists don't have to be antagonistic to all players, but to only one or two, or even an NPC ally. So be careful if they're acting antagonistic only to one or two. Sometimes that can work, but sometimes then that puts just too much focus on one of the PCs, and then the others don't feel like they're as involved. The strawman / hologram get out. You think I would let you find my real lair? Zesty Artist, remember that can be interesting once, but then you risk violating player trust. One of the things about illusions in certain editions of D&D was that you only had a chance to detect an illusion if you say, I disbelieve the illusion. And then you illusionists make really lousy villains in some ways, because then all players do every day is every time they meet somebody, they're like, I disbelieve. Somebody walks in, I disbelieve. We go to a tavern, the bartender says, what do you have? I disbelieve that the bartender exists, because they're just convinced that at some point they'll hit upon the illusion. And illusions really are only effective when they happen when you're not expecting them. So there is that. Using an antagonist to GM cab players into a better direction that's a different level tactic. This person is against you, but when we're done, you'll thank them. Eh. 7th is a great meta mechanic for having the villain escape from a defeat. Yes, that's true. So it is totally possible to do a good illusionist villain, but remember that the best illusionists don't rely on their illusions. You know, like it's in the same vein. In Changeling, there are ways to alter your appearance, and if I made it so that somebody altered their appearance all the time and punish the player characters all the time for it, eventually they would just start being paranoid, and I don't want that. So it's all about misdirection. I mean, yes, that's true. The smoke and mirrors, it's a thing. It's a thing that we have to keep in mind. The best illusionists don't rely on their illusions, but they give the illusion that they do. Well, God damn it. Fair. All right. But yeah, so that's a way to make sense of some of these things. Some time ago, I was running Usagi Yojimbo, and I was fiddling with the idea of having the antagonist being a cat. Hence, he would have literally 9 lives. The characters could behead him, and he would be back in the future. But I thought it would be a bit too much. Not if you establish these 9 lives, right? The establishing it as part of the universe and making sure that players understand them is one thing. The other thing that you can do is, kill the villain, and they come back and they're like, "Wait, what is this?" And you're like, "Well, I'm a cat. I have 9 lives. That was my 7th." So that it doesn't have to be like all 9 lives, right? So that, the players don't have to feel too much frustration with it. But like, there are interesting things you can do with that. How does somebody feel once they are on their 8th life? Do they change their ways because they realize that they have nothing left after this and they're scared of going into the void screaming? Ergon says, we have a game trope where there was always the initial confrontation, and then the villain would send minions forward so they could escape or teleport out or go invisible to escape for the final confrontation later. And we ended up naming that move after the DM, like, oh, they're Johning out. And the DM ended up taking a hint that it was getting dissatisfying when it's happening so often. They still use the move, but not as frequently, and acknowledge that they're doing it as a promise that we're getting the final confrontation later. Yeah, there are ways to kind of wink and nod to your players and say like, hey, you know what? Yep, they're getting away, but that's just because you're going to really enjoy the next room when this happens again. But this is, again, a matter of player trust. And if players feel like they can no longer trust that the universe is fair, because here's the thing. The universe is not fair. Because what is fair? Fairness, is it random chance? Because if it's random chance, players will at times hit a losing streak. Is fair that you make sure that the players win half the time? Players won't remember the times that they won. They'll remember the times that they lost. Is fair that the players always win? There are a lot of questions around that. The main thing, though, is that the game isn't fair, but it should feel like players have agency and that things are done in the service of the story. Beyond that, fairness is it is a difficult situation to be in. And that means that your players have to trust that you have their best interests at heart. And if you're constantly jerking them around, they won't keep that trust in you. Or villain comes back pressing the players to research what the fuck is going on and find a potential weakness. Yeah, or if every NPC betrays the players, then the players will expect every NPC to betray them. PCs will learn the lessons you teach them. Yes. Look, if you show the characters a hot stove and they touch the hot stove and they get burned, and if they do that 4 times and then the 5th time you're like, touch it. No, I swear it's not on. It's not hot. And you want to touch it. Go ahead and touch it. They're not going to want to. They've learned their lesson. Maybe it's just a sexy stove. Also remember that if you need to research a potential weakness, make sure that you encourage the players to realize that there is a way to win. Players can often be a very there are times where players will give up way too quickly. This especially happens in large scale play like LARPing. But sometimes they'll get somebody who'll be like, what, this guy has 500 hit points? Fuck it, we can never beat him. And they just leave. Or in D&D, if you have like a group of 5th level adventurers and there's a 15th level lich who shows up and they're like, we can't beat somebody who's 15th level. So they don't try and they give up and they just leave it. And they're like, nope, somebody else has to deal with it because we're too weak to deal with it. Players will give up if you don't give them reason to believe that they can succeed. Yeah, every door is trapped. So the funny thing is, Requiem, is that we don't necessarily know if Evan traps all of his doors or if Arthur is just paranoid. But I'm willing to say right here that it's probably both. That Evan probably has one too many times pulled a trap on them, and so they have reason to be paranoid. But I also thoroughly believe that Arthur metagames way too much. Players are either weirdly defeatist or they're the most insane, tenacious people either, even unto death. Yep, absolutely. Them gloves, though. But see, Erwin, so the interesting things about the referencing LARPs, for people who may not have seen it, as a web series that I wrote that explores role-playing and live-action role-playing, but specifically actually explores it's really a show about people. It's not really a show about role-playing, but it's on Amazon Prime. You can go watch it. But the thing about Kara's Gloves of Night in that situation is that as much as Evan tried twice to like warn them about the curse, if players don't figure out about the curse, they won't think about it and we're like, oh, I did something stupid. They'll think, oh, you didn't make it clear enough to me what I was supposed to do. As much as Evan might have tried and then let it play out to try to teach his players a lesson, Arthur took that as, you tried to screw me over again, even if he was given every opportunity to succeed. So, yeah, there you go. There's the link. Go do that. And hey, if you're feeling especially generous, apparently some people are trying to reverse the brigading that happened to us on IMDb. We were comfortably in the 8s, and then one day we found we were in the 4s, and we still don't know why. We don't know who did it, but it was definitely a brigading. Possibly somebody who was brigading against our show in particular, possibly somebody who just didn't like Geek and Sundry, possibly it was a For the Lulz brigade from a 4chan like thing. We don't know. It might have even been a rival web series trying to drag our value down so that their value could go up. But yeah, if you feel like you can, leaving a review on IMDb, especially if you can leave even a 1-sentence text review, it would help us. But that's only if you have the gumption for it. I ain't. Kate, I don't even know if yeah, the bot's not running. So there's no... It's not CloudBot. This is RPGClinic. I've always believed that Evan knew of all the characters in the party would immediately put on the curse, it would be Arthur. So if they didn't take the opportunity to get the warnings, and it falls on someone who was incautious anyway. Yeah, they do. Look, Evan is not a good person a lot of the time. None of the characters in LARPs are good people all the time. They've all done shitty things. So, which is why whenever somebody was like, oh, poor Evan, I'm like, he doesn't deserve your pity. He really doesn't. I'll endorse anything. I mean, I guess that's good. Probably not. Competition from other web series at WebFest is what I was thinking. Possibly Rock Pants. But the thing is, it's just finding out what it is doesn't really matter. If there's one thing that I know, it's that I can feel good about the quality of the work that I've produced, and I will take criticism. I will understand it and read it and parse it. But I've also learned to know when somebody has an agenda with their criticism. I mean, hell, the reviews that I've seen for some of the RPGs that I've run, and I've been like, yep, some of this is quite valid, and some of this is like, oh, so I didn't do it exactly the way that you wanted me to, so that makes me bad. No. One of the hallmarks of somebody who you can, and I'm not saying this makes me a great artist, one of the hallmarks of great artists is that they can understand when criticism is valid, that they will appreciate it when people give them criticism and take it when it's done in good faith. But there are times where you have to go against what someone is telling you. So, there we go. Now the bot's back up. It should meme Dark Helmet in the middle of the garden pizza party scene. I'm surrounded by assholes. Joker has an interesting question. So recently I learned there is a TTRPG about a CDC team. And yes, I know it's too real. But how would I tackle a disease or plague in a game as sort of an antagonist or force of nature? It is a task that needs to be completed. Find out in what ways you would have the players complete the task and what ways to make that interesting. So if a plague is literally just I roll my medicine check and I figured out the cure, then all you did was ask the players to roll one die. Not very interesting. Having them go and find the elements of the cure because they're known but they're rare and difficult to find, that could be interesting. Finding ways to help contain a plague, that could be interesting. Inspiring people to do things like fucking wear masks or not travel. You could do a game where you would have somebody who's intentionally trying to spread the disease and you have to stop them, but also in such a way that you have to prevent panic from arising. There's a lot you can do about it. Unfortunately, you're correct. Right now, it is a little too close to home, and so it's not a game that I would be running. I'm not. Ask me again in 10 years, and I'll be more into potentially that idea. But Evan keeps a loaded Nerf gun under his bed. Yes, yep, absolutely. The Nerf gun equilibrium fight justifies itself without a need for logic. That was my intention. Honestly, that was just like, yeah, fuck it, let's just do this. I don't need the reality of LARPs to be absolutely real. One of my family core design rules, if you can give me a solid reason why I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Yeah. Understandable, there's a reason I don't want to run Judge Dredd. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look, gaming is meant to be a way for us to explore and have fun, but it's also sometimes a means to escape, and it's sometimes difficult to let that happen. So, if it's too close to the real thing, if it's too close to home. So yeah, there is that. It comes with the caveat other rule. The designer is always right, but when paired with the buffs, things work. Believing that I'm always correct is totally a bad thing. Look, I know that I'm not always correct. I know that I'm wrong a lot. I know that I'm wrong a lot about role-playing games. And I'm doing a fucking, like, ask me anything coaching thing about role-playing games here. There are games that I've run which have not worked out. There are games that I've run which have tanked and failed. Now, I've learned from those failures, and that's part of how I've built on my successes. But I'm definitely not saying that I'm immune now and that any game that I run will work out. I mean, that would be quite foolish of me to admit. Water's great sometimes, isn't it? Who doesn't like a good water? Yeah. Let's see if there's anything else about villains that we need to get into here. Okay, so how do I feel about games where the GM is the antagonistic force? Paranoia or Kobolds Ate My Baby? I love Paranoia, but I also recognize that Paranoia is a game that has a limited function. to it. Paranoia is great as a palate cleanser. I don't think I would want to run it as a long-term campaign, but I also know that the theme of Paranoia is one in which players are encouraged to do things like not form attachments and to not trust anybody, and that's sort of the point, but it's also why those games can't run for terribly long. Paranoia is a very specific experience. Bit of a side question or not from earlier. How do one feel of the players having their team, the GM having their antagonist group, and towards the end there's a reveal that the masked evil group were actually copies of the player group? Bit of a trope or not cool, kind of the player villain related. Now, do you mean like the linear guild? So like in Order of the Stick, the evil group that was just a copy of every character's, but like the mirror universe equivalent? I mean, it's a trope. It is a corny trope in a lot of ways, so you just have to be careful if you're using it. Any trope potentially can be a useful one to use, but I would say that this one, it will be played for comedy more than anything else, because it's been done and parodied so many times. The Thing scenario is a hard one to pull. You're right, but remember that the Thing also benefits from one writer having total control over everything. How would you suggest running a villain that is meant to act like an ally before some inevitable betrayal? This is a bit difficult thing to do well. Plant hints. Plant hints. Now, they don't necessarily have to be super obvious hints, although I'll point out that players can often be very oblivious, and sometimes what you think is very obvious is something that they will miss entirely. And you can also plant hints that start raising suspicion, but then immediately sort of like have an alibi, and then at the end sort of make it clear that like, oh, the alibi wasn't actually, like, the alibi was bogus. But if you don't plant hints, then players feel like you just pulled the rug out from under them randomly, that you decided that the best way to pull emotions from them is to manipulate them. So as an example, let's say that I was running a game. This is a very simple thing, and it's right off the top of my head. But let's say I'm running a D&D game where there's you're escorting a princess to another kingdom, and every once in a while, you encounter animals that have been drained completely of their blood. So they're like, oh, there must be a vampire around. And then at the very end, the princess becomes the vampire. And you're like, oh, you were the vampire all along. Ha. Well, okay. This might actually work if they hadn't encountered the princess before, right? Because, hey, we didn't know anything about this princess, and weird things started happening right when the princess joined our group, so players can accept that reality. But let's say that this princess has been seen for like 40 separate episodes, 40 separate game sessions, then all of a sudden this princess turns out who, like, you've fallen in love with, who you've like made friends with, and then all of a sudden it turns out that this princess is betraying you for another kingdom. If you haven't sown some doubt in there, you're in trouble. But that doubt can be allayed. Like, it could have been like, hey, somebody somebody snuck a spy into the castle. Well, who did it? And it's never found out. Well, now people can be like, oh, the princess. And your players will be like, I knew it was the princess who let the spy in there. No, they necessarily did not. And they didn't voice it. But as long as your players can convince themselves that they could have potentially thought of it, then you can make it work. But even if they were like, oh, I bet the princess totally let that spy in, and then it turns out that the spy has evidence on their person that shows that it was some low-level guard who let it in, thus deflecting suspicion away from the princess, there was still suspicion to begin with, so it's less of a bitter pill to swallow when that betrayal happens. So it happens. Joker says, so I'm running Cyberpunk and one of the players is a musician. She started with an NPC boyfriend who was taking care of her, but I'm afraid that he may become an antagonist by wanting to take care of her. Like currently a corporal offered her a music contract, but he rejected the contract without her knowing. Make sure that your player is aware of this right off the bat, and also make sure that you're not crossing a line. Controlling romantic partners, unless you're very familiar with your players, you don't know if that's actually occurred in somebody's life before, and that can be a pretty personal thing to bring up. So just be careful about that. Hindsight's always 2020. Hindsight might always be 2020, but you also want the players to feel like the hindsight had a chance, like that there was actually something to see, right? You want that hindsight to be triggered, because if there was like, this came out of fucking nowhere, that's a problem. Good. I'm glad, Joker. That's good. That's kind of what you want to hear. I dropped a spy in my PC's last game with no big hints, but it was also a tertiary character that they forgot about, and their betrayal didn't really deprive the players of something they worked for and cherished. So, like, that's another thing. It's okay for a betrayal if the character is just some nobody. You know, it would be like the equivalent of if I sort of came forward and I said, I don't know, Marnie ended up being a spy in Changeling. You know, like if that was in the first 2 sessions, people might feel differently about it. But if after session 120, where she hadn't really appeared in 100 episodes, then that's a relatively safer bet than me being like, oh, Kyoko betrayed you, right? Like there's a difference between the two. Characters that players don't have a lot of emotional investment in means that they won't have a lot of emotional investment with the betrayal. So it's okay. I mean, but also think about it. Like, if you're just doing it for betrayal's sake, then you're wasting your betrayal. Remember that you only get one, or typically you get one. Sometimes you might be able to pull off more, but if you only get one betrayal, do you really want to waste it on a tertiary character? So, just as a way to think about it. Although Real Brick Wall, I trust. So I'm not. Again, if I'm coming up with examples of something that you've brought up and something that's happened in your game, I'm not saying that this is what happened in your game. I'm saying this is just something to watch out for. As my last, what would be a good way to turn an antagonist into a villain that's not meant as such? Just escalate over time. Justification for villainy. So, if somebody is an like say it's a cop, and the cop is just somebody who's against your characters because they don't always operate on the side of the law, but you want to turn that cop into a villain, there needs to be justification for it. Maybe the cop, maybe at one point the player characters succeed at something and then the cop loses their job because they should have been the ones to crack the case and didn't. Or maybe the player characters proved that the cop wasn't all on the up and up, and then the cop is like, well, now I don't have any money, so now I have to commit crimes in order to support my family, and then they slowly become a villain. Or it could be that the cop just becomes increasingly frustrated with the idea that everybody's like totally okay with these vigilantes running around, and so they decide that they have to take matters into their own hands, and then they try to kill the player characters. That's justification, and justification is kind of what you need to whenever you're shifting a character in any way, there must be a reason. The reason doesn't necessarily have to be something that makes sense in today's world. It has to make sense in the world in which you're playing in. So Joker says, because of the talk, I'm still considering if torture should be something in my game. I won't depict torture, but I will mention how the Inquisition has methods to get information. I'm thinking of the Han Solo scene where we see him about to be tortured, but then we switch to another player, and when we switch back, the deed is done. I think that's fine. One of the things that we kind of have to look at also is there's a big difference between seeing something done and seeing its effects, and knowing something was done but not seeing its effects or seeing it happening. So if you torture a character and the character comes out and is just like totally not okay, or even has like bruises and stuff like that, that's one thing. But if the character starts describing after the fact like all the little things that they did to torture them, well, then you're bringing torture into the game. right? Like, it doesn't matter that it's not happening right then. What matters is that you're describing torture. It's generally okay hand waving things away. It's kind of like also the idea that it's, you know, like I don't need gore to in my games, and that like I don't really need to have like really explicit descriptions of that, in much the same way that I don't need to have really explicit descriptions of sex, but I do want, you know, violence and sex to exist in my games. So it's all in the way that you hand wave it. It's all in the way that you imply things, and to find out where your players' barriers are. Because also, if you say, hey, the Inquisition has methods to get information, and a player immediately is like, whoa, I don't want to deal with torture, then you can have a discussion about it, you know? Or if you say, if somebody hasn't made it very explicitly clear that torture is a problem for them, you can ask them. And somebody has the right to revoke their consent or to give their consent after they've revoked it. So if you're like, oh, I shouldn't do torture, and then a player's like, yeah, but I'm going to torture a character now, well, then it's okay to reopen the conversation if that character was the one, that player was previously the one who wasn't okay with it, because maybe they've rethought their position on things. Talk to people if you're at all worried about it. And you can just literally say like, hey players, so I'm thinking about putting in a group of people in the game who will occasionally use interrogation techniques that might include torture. We're not actually going to get into the torture, but like they do these sorts of things. Is that okay? And they'll tell you if the answer is yes or no. As long as you create that fosterness, that open. Makes me think of how to depict sex in games. If two PCs are about to do it, I just switch other players, and when we come back, they're lying in bed smoking. I mean, that's the standard, you know, turn and face, wafting curtains. We've done RPG Clinic After Dark, but it's been years, so it might be time to do another one. I mean, when I say years, I mean like it's been like before Exaltwitch, I think, was the last time we did a dedicated one. I could be wrong. Fade to Blacks. But sex is a thing. It's important to figure out what your players are comfortable with and what you're comfortable with. But that's a topic that we can probably cover on its own. It's not... other than use your word hole and fade to blacks, that's not something that I think I can cover in 9 minutes. Cause yeah, I mean, look, if you've tracked my game so far, sex has played a role in a lot of them. So, oh, it's before Changeling. Yeah, maybe it happened after the start of Exaltwitch. We've made more than one Mel Brooks reference in the chat today, so that's totally fine. Are there any other questions brought up? Because I can start wrapping up at this point because we're nearing close to the end. Tomorrow, Liz is going to have her triumphant return to Punchy. That'll be on twitch.tv/Elizabeth A. Neal, and that'll be at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Remember that it's Standard Time now, not Daylight Time. Oh, okay. See, well, it's been a while, and clearly I've forgotten everything. But we can bring After Dark back at some point. And then after that on Saturday, there's a chance that that Liz may bring Drew Crew back because she didn't get a chance to do it yesterday, but you'll have to check the Discord for that. And there's also Scott will probably not be streaming, so someone else may stream instead. It could be Kate, it could be me. Kate's been streaming an awful lot during the day. She's been streaming Genshin Impact, but also streaming her NaNoWriMo efforts. They're very cool, chill streams and totally worth tuning into, especially if you're somebody who is in a time zone that is a bit more advanced than the ones that I'm currently in. Kathy is doing a 24-hour charity stream on Saturday. That's right. So maybe it's not the best time to stream. That's absolutely true. So yeah, do that. But And then Sunday is Star Wars Reach. Not really a villain question, but is it a good move or not to do rolls for the characters to get infected? Let's say a character gets a condition that will turn him into a monster. Is it a good idea to let the player do the rolls or do the rolls for him, not letting him know what's going on with him? It depends on the kind of game that you're running and depends on the sort of thing that you want to try to keep from your players. Any role that you are hiding from the player is a role that you are doing one of two things. Either you don't want your players to know what the answer is, or you want to choose what the answer is and make your players think that it's up to chance. But they're not necessarily going to be convinced. I would say in general, the thing that I would do in that situation is I would roll and show everyone but the player character if you really didn't want them to know. Like, I would get a third party involved. I'd get another player to be like, witness this roll for me. Boop, there you go. And then they'd sit back down and be like, well, now you know that it was up to chance and someone else knows what's going to happen to you, but you don't know yourself right now. So there is that. Yeah, the Discord's really the best place to look. So go and have a look there. The Discord is linked and it is a way to check on things. So there you go. How would I convince my player to go to bed after being awake for 20 hours because they really wanted to watch a Clinic episode about villains? I would just disconnect. So I can do that. I can save the crosshair at this point by ending the stream. I hope to see you soon. I hope that you're still taking care of yourself, especially in this time. So be good, everybody. And thanks for tuning in. Hopefully we'll get another great topic for next RPG Clinic. See you later.